Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're watching this video from. Thank you so much for tuning in and for an expressed interest in this talk and in this topic. Before I begin, I would just love to extend my warm gratitude to those at Monash in the Korean Studies program, and especially to Soyeon, who's been working tirelessly behind the scenes to connect with me and to make this as smooth as possible. So I appreciate you all so much. And I'd like to state at the outset that I am currently zooming in from living and working on the unceded territories of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts nations. This is, of course, where Harvard's campus is located. And I think that in the face of ongoing, multiple, and converging crises, it is imperative to interrogate the historical and ongoing complicity in colonial processes, of course, of which Harvard is not exempt. There is a somewhat inconspicuous, but nonetheless violent continued dispossession of Indigenous lands and the marginalization of Indigenous knowledges in the academy, all of which merit a sustained critique and discussion, especially for those of us who feel deeply and at times sharply that all is not well in the academy. My hope is that we might continue to commit to ways of actively centering Indigenous epistemologies in, for some of us through our teaching and for others perhaps through your research, in ways that don't take calls to decolonize the university euphemistically, and that we might resist relegating indigeneity to a distant past. So today, instead of one sort of self-contained presentation, I'd love to present a couple of projects I've been working on in the hopes that this could be kind of more of an overview. And I would love to hear your thoughts to get a sense of what folks are engaging with in the research. Especially, I love hearing from students. So feel free to comment on this video or to email me. My email is right there, or to connect with me via social media. And I understand that many of you have been engaging these topics on K-pop, language and race in the context of Dr. Brown's class. So I'm currently working through some ideas which I think can be best encapsulated under the rubric of the semiotics of appropriation. Here's a bit of a roadmap that I prepared for today's talk. I'll begin with a brief discussion of my article, which was published just last year on this very topic. Then I'll discuss a different project, which examines the practices of K-pop fans in the Mexican context and shifting meanings or different meanings perhaps around appropriation. And then finally leave enough time for hopefully what would have been a discussion. But yes, the first part, the first half or so will be more of a presentation, and the second half will be a paper, a working paper, and I'll be reading that portion. So some of the questions that have been guiding my thinking in this overall rubric and this overall kind of research agenda include: how can appropriation be recuperated as an analytic? Oftentimes in popularly discussions, appropriation is often left undefined or kind of reproduces kind of simplified notions of power. Secondly, how might appropriation be better understood by attending to semiotic processes? So I will be using a lot of theories from linguistic anthropology as well as semiotic anthropology. What does appropriation say about persistent historical and contemporary relations structured by colonialism, chattel slavery, and empire? Sort of this socio-historical explanation for contemporary phenomena like appropriation. And lastly, how do we attend to the complexity of transnational processes so that we might not prioritize a kind of a US-based or a global north framework? So before talking about the actual paper, I'd like to zoom out for a little bit and give a sense of what motivated my article and this project at its earliest stages. And in the sort of first major iteration of my paper, I was really just interested in the language and conventions of hip hop, which were being used in K-pop, which is quite a widespread practice. And of course, linguistic appropriation and broader cultural appropriation is not easily teased apart because as language theorists, discourse analysts, and linguistic anthropologists have long noted, language and culture are in fact inextricable. Richard Rogers, who is a communication scholar working on appropriation, discusses how communication indexes social relations and hence necessarily political relations. However, as I mentioned, the notion of cultural appropriation is often left under-theorized, and oftentimes, even in the academic literature, is frequently left undefined. So as this project progressed, I also wanted to understand the discursive and material effects of appropriation, which forced me to move away from simple kind of one-off acts of appropriation, and instead to attend to the processes and motivating factors of such acts. So in thinking about possible definitions of appropriation, I like Rogers's definition as a kind of starting point. He writes, quote, the use of one's culture's symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture, regardless of intent, ethics, function, or outcome. And I like this as a starting point because it removes the kind of intent or the motivations of the appropriating actor. And I think that's a really important kind of starting point whereby ideologies of sort of personalism or intentionality are taken out of the equation and rather on the processual or kind of action-oriented aspect of appropriation. One thing I will say though, in his use of sort of one culture symbols, it's unclear what is meant by culture. So I think we can kind of problematize how cultures are being used when talking about appropriation, because as the abundant literature in anthropology has established, cultures are not frequently not clearly bounded, discrete, or immune to any kind of change. And simultaneously in this definition, a kind of sustained or problematized understanding of power is not really evident. So a simple dominant subordinate binary, which is often invoked in discussions of appropriation, may not always apply. And trying to identify asymmetrical power relations between cultures, of course, is complicated by the varying forms that power can take and the varying scales at which power can operate, right? And so emphasizing the role of kind of macro structures such as sociopolitical context risks erasing agency at a maybe more micro level and vice versa, right? By focusing maybe too much on individual or group entity agency, then the broader context may become sort of de-emphasized. So in thinking about the history of appropriation in the K-pop industry, we really have to go back to the beginning of the division of the Korean Peninsula, right? So the first traces of US popular culture in South Korea are attributed to US military occupation in the mid-1900s. Crystal Anderson, for instance, traces the roots of R&B in South Korea to Black military personnel. And so these Black musical genres were introduced through dominant forms of popular culture in the US that then traveled to South Korea with the military presence. And at this time as well, we must account for US hegemony in the realm of popular culture globally, right? Not just in the form of musical production, but also film and sort of these moving productions. And then in the first sort of appearance of K-pop into the global scene is almost unanimously attributed to the appearance of this band at the top here, Seotaeji and Boys, right, in the early 90s, 92 to be exact. And early on, one could see the heavy borrowing of US Black forms, not just in terms of their embodied styles, which is quite apparent in these images, but also in their actual musical production, right? So heavy borrowing of samples from 70s East Coast hip hop, as well as West Coast gangster rap melodies. And early on as well, the role of Korean Americans was formidable. So not only children who had moved to and immigrated to the US at an early age, but in fact, ethnic Koreans who were born in the US and then traveled back to South Korea, sometimes alone, sometimes with their families, and became heavily influenced by US forms. And the role of international producers has always been really crucial in the K-pop industry. So Soo-kyung Kim at UCLA goes as far to say it's kind of questionable the extent to which K-pop can be considered a Korean genre, given the kind of long-standing influence of international actors. So as I mentioned, last year, I published an article in Gender and Language called Where Are My Bad Girls At? Cosmopolitan Femininity Through Racialized Appropriations in K-pop. And K-pop fans in watching this will recognize this image as the picture of the K-pop band 21, who recently reunited at Coachella during the solo performance of CL, who's featured here from the third from the left. And in my article, I focused on CL's performance as a kind of case study of appropriation to examine how and why appropriation occurs in K-pop and how it might be interpreted by different audiences. So the research questions guiding this project were as follows. How do particular kinds of gender identities and sexualities get constructed through popular music lyrics specifically? What can the now globalized genre of K-pop tell us about circulations of language and discourses about women and notions of femininity? And how does K-pop reproduce gendered and racialized images? And how does it sort of get away with these linguistic and other forms of appropriation? So in analyzing CL's 2013 song and video called 나쁜 기집애, I posited at least two different interpretations that could emerge from and coexist in her performance. First, I argued that CL's performance might be interpreted as an act of empowerment. More specifically, she projects this globalized cosmopolitan femininity by embodying and localizing the figure of the bad bitch, which is a sexually agentive and controversial figure of womanhood that emerges from US hip hop. And by using features of African American English and hip hop conventions, she's able to re-signify this pejorative Korean term for women, 기집애. On the other hand, I showed how the video it features a number of decontextualized styles, which for many viewers will invoke a particular time and space. These decontextualized styles, which allow for the artist to gain additional indexical meaning, is something that I called chronotopic capital. The case of the video that I analyzed, the highly selective appropriations of historically Black and Mexican American cultural signifiers, I argued, reproduce narrow images of racialized femininities. So in order to operationalize the idea of appropriation as a kind of meaning-making process, I gravitated towards Bakhtin's theorization of the chronotope. Bakhtin effectively shows how time and space in novelistic discourse are mobilized to shape different literary genres, as well as to produce different character types. This socially recognizable type has been theorized by linguistic anthropologists such as Asif Agha. So in my analysis, I treat racialized representations as a kind of chronotopic depiction while attempting to attend to the ways that meaning depends sort of heavily on the positionality of the interpreter, which is true for all indexical meaning. So here is the figure of CL for those who may not be familiar. On the left here, you see her kind of during her K-pop idol, K-pop band days. And then in 2015 on the right images, she is attempting this crossover into the US market. And so you do see kind of a shift in her embodied style. And I'll just show a brief clip of the two parts I'll be focusing on today. Okay, so here's just kind of a visual idea of my transcript of the chorus, which I analyze, and just moving quickly for the sake of time, I will just say that it was crucial to attend to not only the language in and of itself, but the different hip hop conventions that are used in the song and video in order to construct this bad bitch persona. And so the song is reminiscent of a subgenre of hip hop, of rap called trap. And so there's a noticeable bass line as well as a slowed down tempo. And at the outset of the music video, there is an auto-tuned voice that says "Stand up right now," which is reminiscent of the call and response tradition of many hip hop performances. Also throughout the song, but notably in the chorus, CL engages in a rhetorical device, if you will, within K-pop, hip hop called braggadocio or braggadocio, wherein artists will boast about such themes as physicality, fighting ability, financial wealth, sexual prowess, or emotional detachment. And so specifically focusing on just the language in the Napun Kijibe chorus, in the repeated line in English, "Where are my bad girls at?" we find two classic features of African American English, including zero copula and a monophthongized mai. And there's a notable diphthongization of the word kijibe to kijibe. Sociolinguists have found that Korean rappers, or those who study K-pop, have found that Korean rappers do adopt features of African-American English and something called, that Moon, Star, and Lee have called anglicized Korean, where the pronunciation of Korean is using this sort of English-influenced pronunciation, as in the case of Kichibe. And the rapping, and the same group of researchers, Moon et al., found that the rapping members of K-pop groups use a higher rate of I monophthongization, this feature of AAE, suggesting that the rappers do tend to perform African-American English more than the singing members of a K-pop group. So this presence of nan, which is the informal singular first person pronoun na, with the postposition 는, and added with the first syllable of napun, add this kind of taunting quality to the chorus, which also adds to the overall persona of this napun kichibe, of this bad bitch, who is kind of taunting and engaging in this genre of braggadocio. So of course, most obviously are the racialized appropriations in the video itself. So I focus here on two personae, the B-girl persona and later the chola persona. And so here she's performing a very feminized, commercialized B-girl dance, B-girl, which stands for breakdancing girl. This persona indexes authentic hip hop, as breakdancing was considered one of the classic tenets of original hip hop. But the pervasive sort of presence of gold accessories makes it very clear that she's presenting a very commercialized version of this persona and not necessarily an authentic or down-to-earth persona. And of course, these gold accessories are very common in commercialized hip hop more broadly. And the chronotype of that is invoked through the persona of the B girl, I argued, is of the street. right? And this is a trope that is used throughout hip hop music. And oftentimes the street is an important locus of cultural activity for US based hip hop artists. And so I argued that CL, by invoking the street through these stylistic choices, is able to authenticate her performance as a rapper, not necessarily through intimate familiarity, but through an indexical association with the street. So the second persona that CL performs is the Chola. And so there are clear elements of Chicanx street culture all throughout the video, but most saliently in the second half. So the choice of accessories, the makeup, such as like eyeliner, are all practices that have been found to be documented as popularized by Chola women. And I think it's important to emphasize that a lot of these signs function together, right? They're not isolated pieces necessarily. So also the Old English lettering that you see kind of in the second image here, and the different graffiti fonts derived from Cholo tattoo culture. There are also notably different vehicles such as lowrider bicycles and lowrider automobiles in the back, which are associated with working class Mexican Americans. And so all of these different disembodied styles function, as I argued, as remixed chronotopes. There's bits and pieces of chronotopes here and there. And these incredibly urban aesthetics are in a markedly unmodern environment, or in an environment that is actually quite unmarked in the case of just a white background. And so there is a simultaneous index of past and present, urban and rural. So this, I argued, obscures the linkages to the historically racialized groups from whom these cultural signifiers are derived. So I argued that, of course, transnational circulation opens up the performance to varying interpretations. And as I said at the outset, there are at least two interpretations of CL's performance. Some might interpret it as quite creative and agentive. It may even open up the sort of visibility of different racialized femininities. However, as I stressed, the performance relies on these hegemonic images of US Black and Brown femininities, and the appropriations of this nature kind of obfuscates or blurs the pathways of situated histories. And as such chronotopes circulate, they might shed some of their indexical meaning, a process known as indexical bleaching, as discussed by Laura Squires. And so I would like to just end with this kind of quote. K-pop's global circulation has far-reaching implications for racial dynamics, including exporting the notion that racialized depictions become everyone's property. So I'll end that kind of portion of the talk there. And I'd like to transition into a kind of second project I've been working on. And for today's purposes, this working paper is titled K-pop Fandom in Mexico, Transnational Performance and Clashing Interpretations. And I will be reading. So K-pop fans constitute a global discursively mediated public. We might think of this as kind of a global kind of public, global community, which encompasses entities such as individuals and smaller groups across geographic contexts who discuss, debate, and oftentimes critique the affairs of the K-pop world. And they do so mainly through social media. Indeed, it has been this active and highly organized social media participation that has captured global attention in recent years, ranging from the disruption of Trump's Tulsa rally or the flooding of the Blue Lives Matter hashtag on Twitter by fans of the K-pop band BTS. In fact, BTS's live performance at the 2018 Billboard Music Awards is widely considered a watershed moment for K-pop, representing not only the global popularity of a single musical genre or band, but the intensity of K-pop fans, as reflected in their mediatized affective displays and meticulous reenactments of dance choreographies. Mediatized performances are frequently prone to circulation in contexts not original to their production, hence they're vulnerable to uptake from disparate, perhaps even unintended publics. In this working paper, I examined the local meaning surrounding performances of young Mexicans who participate in digital K-pop fandoms, especially the genre of K-pop dance cover, which I will explain. From the perspective of both non-participants and K-pop fans that I interviewed in Mexico City, their praxis is quite distinctive within the broader sphere of popular culture in the Mexican context. Thus, I treat Mexican K-pop fans as a counter public within the context of the broader Mexican public. In a brief comparative analysis of videos wherein dancers emulate their favorite K-pop bands, I focus on how they perform and registered features associated with the style known as aegyo, indexical of a youthful Korean femininity. By examining fans' metapragmatic discourse about their own performance, that is, what they say explicitly about their own performance, and looking at viewer responses, I hope to show how transnational online performances are susceptible to negotiation amid converging interpretive frames. So rather than read fan practices as determined by the consumerist influence of K-pop, or as conscious acts of appropriation that reproduce facile notions of power and agency, I argue that their performances constitute socioculturally specific contestations of personhood and power. More specifically, I examine how citational acts of appropriation open up possibilities for queer performance by some K-pop fans. As theorists of citationality have argued, citational acts can proliferate in lexical meaning, thus enhancing their performative power. I'm interested in this sort of newer meaning that proliferates from these citational performances. So the data I present today comes from face-to-face and online ethnographic fieldwork I've conducted with Mexican K-pop fans since 2016. I'll be focusing on one group of such fans, a dance group called Guys Generation, which is an explicit homage to the K-pop girl band Girls' Generation, one of the most successful bands of the genre. This dance group was founded in 2010, that is the Guys Generation, and the membership may fluctuate between 2 and 9 members, and they are still active as a cover dance group. The K-pop dance cover refers to a genre of dance choreography where fans of K-pop form their own dance groups and recreate the choreographies of well-known K-pop bands. Sometimes these choreographies digress very little from the original composition, while other groups choose to change it altogether, adding their own stylistic flair or stylistic elements. Dancers often compete in local and international competitions, presenting a kind of group style, usually reflected by the kinds of songs that they choose to cover. Um, Group membership might range from 2 to 12 members, and they often hold regular auditions to recruit new members. Dancers are generally quite young. In a survey of Mexican cover groups I conducted in 2016, all 21 dancers I surveyed were young adults ranging from 18 to 26 years of age. So endemic to the dance cover genre is the reliance on sameness for its intelligibility. We understand this to be a direct appropriation by sheer virtue of the genre of dance cover. Crucially, the difference of this kind of new version produces intertextual gaps which allow for the dance cover to do additional semiotic work. Put differently, the metasemiotic understandings of sameness and difference allow for citational acts, such as the dance cover, to open up new forms of signification or meaning making. The following section presents a brief comparative analysis of Guys Generation's recorded dance cover of Girls' Generation song G, which was the best-selling single of 2009 in South Korea. The music video begins with the original 9 members being displayed as mannequins in a clothing store while a handsome young employee closes shop. And once he leaves, the mannequins come to life after hours and are shown swooning over a picture of him. And I'll just show a very brief clip of that. Performance studies scholar Juyeon Oh, who does a close reading of this music video, characterizes Girls' Generation's performance as, quote, hyper girlish femininity that prioritizes submissiveness, pureness, and cuteness over the westernized notion of powerful and independent womanly sexiness, end quote. This hyper girlish femininity that Oh identifies refers to Aegyo, an unregistered, embodied, and linguistic style associated with displays of affection, including behaving in a coquettish or cheeky manner, and is often glossed as cuteness. Several linguistic features have been identified for Aegyo, including nasality of segments that are usually non-nasal, rising falling intonation at prosodic boundaries, gendered lexical terms such as oppa, and infantile sounds. I've also frequently observed the use of higher pitch and the use of rhetorical questions that index helplessness, such as the one found in repeatedly in the G chorus, 어떻게 하죠? Right? What should I do? Aegyo can be performed bodily through facial expressions and gestures, such as shrugs, nods, and movements that iconize smallness. Cuteness becomes indexically linked with childlikeness, thus linking the performance of Aegyo with youthfulness. These indexical features are highly gendered, with some scholars suggesting that it indexes a docile femininity. Others have argued that despite its associations with childlikeness, that the performance of Aegyo can be agentive insofar as women persuasively assert their desires through the use of the register. While Aegyo femininity is but one type of many forms of feminine performance in South Korea at large and in K-pop bands' repertoires, it is an unregistered style that becomes associated with K-pop bands, probably due to the intimacy produced between fans and K-pop idols through such public affective performances. Because of its markedness in the Mexican context, Aegyo is frequently commented on overtly by K-pop fans. There are even YouTube videos dedicated to explaining Aegyo in Spanish, and this style sort of leaks into other modes of offline performance, such as in these images here. So what are Mexican youth, specifically young men, accomplishing then when they perform these dances in their own local context? In their rendition, the members of Guy's generation aim for an exact replica of the original choreography. In mimetic fashion, these young men restrict their movements, which is especially notable in the hands, the leg shuffle, and hip movements. The performance is expectedly saturated with Aegyo, including the tilting of the head, winks, coquettish looks. As is common in K-pop dance cover, each dancer's embodiment of a different girl's generation persona minimizes the intersemiotic gaps between their dance performance and the original. In so doing, the citational semiotics of the dance performance proliferates new indexical meaning not necessarily associated with the original choreography. Indexical meaning which becomes then susceptible to interpretation by multiple publics. Dancers' metapragmatic discourse on their dance praxis suggests that they do not orient to Aegyo as a racialized register. In fact, the lead choreographer and founding member of Guy's generation, Tonyo, describes how he in fact does not like performances of Aegyo altogether, and in fact prefers sexier choreography. Here, Tonyo is describing K-pop groups who most visibly and consistently perform Aegyo. Despite the group's early dedication to covering only songs by Girls' Generation, Tonyo does not consider Girls' Generation to be a group that performs Aegyo, which is counter to the scholarship on K-pop of this time period and of Girls' Generation in particular, as reflected in my own brief analysis above. And so he explicitly frames Aegyo ideologically as an undesirable way of performing femininity. Tonyo's lengthened vowels here in line 4 iconizes childlikeness and perhaps even absurdity with the very register he disprefers, and indirectly indexes a rejection of cute, docile, childlike femininity. Instead, he later expresses his preference for an overtly sexy choreography, preferring an embodied expression of sensuality and sexuality, which he later divulges is not well accepted in the Mexican context. For his undergraduate thesis, Tonyo critically reflects on his own performances of K-pop dance. Um, I will read the translation at the bottom here. He says, dance or el baile. My way of approximating the feminine is through dance, that is through el baile. Dance, la danza, is an art in which what a man should do and what a woman should do are very clearly defined without allowing for doubts or other possibilities. These critical reflections demonstrate dancers' awareness of the markedness of their performance in their local context and underscores the impact of the genre in their own identity formations. Dance here is not merely a pastime or a profession, it is much more consequential. Dance acts as a way to approximate femininity, which is unfathomable in everyday life. Toño distinguishes el baile from la danza, delineating the former as being more liberating and danza as being much more prescriptive vis-a-vis gender norms. I interpret Toño's articulation of el baile as phenomenologically feminine and hence empowering. Insofar as gender is performative, Toño's reflection shows that the expression of non-normative gender has an outlet in the form of dance performance. Guy's generation's citation of K-pop in a mediatized and hence transnational arena leaves their performances open to varied responses from members of disparate publics, ranging from gleeful fan support to trans and homophobic comments online. While most comments from viewers tend to be quite positive, the following queer-phobic comments remind the dancers their performance is marked in their local context. So I won't be reading these aloud, but I did want to just provide a content warning for the comments that are about to ensue in the following slide. While the following comments are from YouTube, the use of Mexican slang such as pinche or padre suggests commenters share the same Mexican nationality. The meta-pragmatic discourses from Guy's generation, as well as from viewer uptake, reveal that the performance of gender is salient, while that of race is not. In other words, young Mexican men's embodiment of egyo becomes marked as a way to do femininity, not as a cross-racial performance. These homophobic, transphobic comments, ranging from mockery to prescriptive comments, highlight the ideological mismatch between gendered choreography and quote unquote appropriate bodily comportment. In these comments, the members of Guy's generation are not only interpolated as gendered subjects, but unruly ones who traverse the realm of indexical femininity. These comments function to regiment circulating ideologies around proper embodied habitus for young Mexican men. In performances of egyo specifically, racial crossing may be camouflaged because gender transgression is much more salient due to the intense stigmatization of transgressing masculinity as a cisgender man in the Mexican context. One frame of interpretation that is of K-pop fans and dancers themselves clashes with that of the broader Mexican public. The result is a clash of indexical ground. What is deemed acceptable diverge in their meta-semiotic frames. Put plainly, if K-pop fans aim to perform race and gender through K-pop dance, interpretants only see gender transgression. The performance of gender is noticed and markedly criticized, while that of race is not. So I will end right there. Those are my references if you would like to take a look there. Thank you so much again to Soyeon and to the folks at Monash University. Here is my email and my social media handle. Please get in contact with me if you have any questions or comments. I really look forward to hearing from you. And thank you for your attention.